afternoon, and a very warm welcome to those of you joining us. I'm just taking a few seconds because there are many people registered this afternoon, so just give you a moment to let more people into the room. But for those who have already joined us, a very warm welcome to this post-summit briefing and EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me this week, as always, are Fabian Zuleeg, who is Chief Executive and Chief Economist at the EPC, and Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies, as we assess the results of this week's EU summit and its potential long-term consequences for the EU. As always, this will be a totally interactive discussion. I have some questions for Janis and Fabian. If you have any questions, please click on the raised hands button, not the chat, and I will ask you to unmute yourself when the time comes, or you can write, in the Q&A box, not the chat was what I meant to say, apologies, Q&A box, and please be as brief as possible with your questions. So let us jump straight in, and Janis, first just give us the big picture. What were they talking about? We know what the biggest issue was. It was who gets what job. What else were they talking about, and what were the big decisions in headline terms?
Well, first of all, as you said, they ended the day on the top jobs because that was the most controversial, most difficult, that at least was the appreciation of things that they had to discuss. So they started with Ukraine. There was in-person Zelensky at the European Council meeting, which, by the way, also celebrated the fact that this week was the start of negotiations with Ukraine, membership negotiations, but they also had to see what is now what are the consequences of the summit on peace that took place in Switzerland, the G7 in Italy. So that's what they started from. Then they had a discussion on security and defense, where it was mostly a discussion about the question of financing, an enhancement of defense cooperation at the European level and what that would mean and how it could be financed, with the question of joint borrowing out there, and especially the Germans saying no, no, no. Then there was a discussion on the Middle East. Again, differences between member states required a discussion also at the top level, but that led to conclusions. And finally, they had a discussion on the strategic agenda, which we will discuss in more detail, which took longer than they had originally expected because of some late final minute requests from Berlin and Paris, joint requests from Berlin and Paris. And it ended, as I said, on a discussion about the EU leadership configuration, which they couldn't settle at the informal meeting a couple of weeks earlier.
Okay, so let's start with that, if we might. They couldn't settle it a couple of weeks ago, but they did settle it, and it was the same names in the frame. Ursula von der Leyen for a second term as Commission President, Antonio Costa, the former Portuguese Prime Minister for the Council Presidency, and the Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas for the High Representative. So we came out with the same three names. What changed that made the deal impossible 2 weeks ago and possible this time around?
Well, I think that there were a number of reasons. One, that we had the reaction from Meloni, and the question was how one could get or should get to an agreement, or at least to a decision of the European Council, which is based on qualified majority voting. Let's not forget in this case. And that needed some time, also to see what actually she wanted. Because when they had the informal meeting, she did express her discontent with the fact that she felt that she and the ECR had not been represented in the fait accompli, as she would put it, from the three main mainstream parties. And second, there was also this idea that came from some, at least in the European People's Party, from the Conservative, to potentially split the presidency of the European Council into twice 2.5 years. Let's not forget, it is twice 2.5 years. The question was whether the second half of the 5-year period in office might potentially be held by someone else. Also,
the EPP backed down over that. Was that because they had overplayed their hand? I'll come to you in a moment, Fabian, to analyse what all this means. But just in factual terms, why did the EPP back down?
Well, first of all, I think that they overplayed their cards. Now you could say that had also to do with the fact that socialists, the last time around, and even in 2011, did not actually get the best out of a potential deal. If you remember at the time, instead of going for the presidency of the European Council last time around, they went for HRVP. So I think that there were some who were speculating, well, let's see whether we can get more out of this, given that we did rather well compared to others, as the EPP assumes, and there is some truth to that. And let's also not forget they think that there's a good chance that two big member states will be in the hands of the conservatives in 2.5 years, both i.e. Germany and also Spain. That's what they have in mind, and so they felt that they should be more strongly represented in the leadership configuration,
Gotcha.
which at the end I think was the wrong thing to ask for.
And Fabian, this issue of Giorgia Meloni and her fury over the way this was handled. She called it effectively a stitch up. She said this was the wrong way to do business. She had appeared to have quite a close relationship with Ursula von der Leyen, but she abstained on that and she voted against Callas and Costa. How significant a rupture is this, given that up until now, Meloni seems to have played her hand rather cleverly on the EU stage and has surprised people in a positive way by her approach to EU negotiations? Do you think there will be any, what do you read into that? And do you think that will have any long-term consequences?
I think what we're seeing here is performative politics. Clearly, this is about not only what is happening, but also how things can be portrayed and playing for the galleries, in particular for the domestic galleries. So for Meloni, it was very important to show that she was standing up for the interests of Italy, that she was very present in these debates, also that she was unhappy. But in the end, it hasn't led to a situation where she's prevented anything. And it's unlikely that will prevent anything happening in the European Parliament. So you could argue it actually shows that the influence is not very high when it comes to these decisions. But I think what we are also seeing is the longer term consequences of a different political constellation overall. Yes, we still have a central majority, but we also now seeing that these parties are flexing their muscles. And when it comes to issues where they might have a more direct interest, they will not be shy about insisting on that. And we don't know what also is happening behind the scenes. Clearly, there's also a question of what portfolio Italy will get in the new commission, what kind of control over money might be going along with that. So I'm sure there's a lot happening, which is also not just this outward performance.
But those who are saying, so you're saying it's performative politics, and those who are saying this is serious because this falling out, apparent falling out between Meloni and Ursula von der Leyen, for example, this, you know, how angry is she? And will she sort of reap her revenge in other areas? You think probably not. This was specific to the issue and specific maybe to Italy getting a big top job. Just to follow up on that,
I mean,
Fabian.
we will come back to this as well. I mean, I think this is not necessarily a short-term concern, but I think what we should be starting to think about is how this is playing with some of the other developments which are in the pipeline. And in particular, if we are going to get another Trump presidency, how many of the parties will start to side very openly with Trump in that situation, arguing that this shows, which is basically the Orban narrative. It shows that there's a different Europe, that what has been represented by these mainstream parties is not the real Europe, is not the real people. And that, I think, is a narrative which we're going to hear a lot over the next years. But I don't think it's going to have a big short-term effect.
Okay. Janis, would you echo that?
Yes, I agree with what Fabian said. I will just add a couple of other concerns. First of all, or thoughts. First of all, that I think still one is not clear what she wants. That was something where a lot of people were speculating. Also, yesterday were speculating of actually what it is that she wants, and it's still not very much clear. However, having said that, when it came to the vote on Ursula von der Leyen, she abstained. She neither supported nor did she vote against her, as Orban did. She abstained. And I think that that, in many ways, from Ursula von der Leyen's perspective, was a good outcome. Because if she would have been in favor of her, that could have caused problems with some in the European Parliament. And let's not forget, this is not an easy ride on the 18th of July. It would have been something which would have made it more difficult for Ursula when it comes to the left, both when it comes to the socialists, but also potentially to some green votes. If she would have voted against her, that would have given the signal, I'm not supporting her, and that would have also been a signal to Fratelli d'Italia and the members of European Parliament from Fratelli d'Italia, which would have been difficult to back from. So I think abstaining
remains to be seen what they will do when
we'll
it comes
see.
to
Yes,
the crunch.
we'll see. But I'm just saying abstaining is from the
left the
perspective
door
of
open.
maybe a good was good news. And let's not forget, and that's something which I think people do not speculate enough about. If there is a failure of Ursula von der Leyen in the European Parliament to get a majority, she might then say, well, you know, I was against also Callas and Costa, and we have to reopen the entire package. So the way in which she has operated, I think, has a lot of second and third guessing, and which we can do in terms of trying to explain why she did it. And we will see, depending on how things develop. But I think there's the obvious thing that she wants also more out of the deal that she might get with respect to the commission post Italy will get. That's clear.
So Ursula von der Leyen, of course, a known quantity in Brussels. It remains to be seen how the electoral shifts and so on affect the agenda. We'll come back to that in a moment. But in terms of Costa and Callas, what do we know about them? And what does that potentially mean in terms of how they're going to approach the job, how the relationships between them will work? Because one of the notable features of von der Leyen 1 has been a certain dysfunctionality between Commission and Council. And we have one of our audience asking, why did Costa go through despite his legal woes? Was there no other candidate? So, I mean, in terms of what we know about them and how they're likely to approach the job, are we likely to see a harmonious top team now, Fabian, do you think? Assuming they all go through. Of course, Costa doesn't need parliamentary approval, only Callas and Ursula von der Leyen. But if this is the team, what's your feeling?
I think the starting point has to be, you were referring to the difficulties we've seen between the top jobs this time round. It can only get better. This kind of negative relationship between two highest level decision makers at the European level is not sustainable. And certainly, I think in terms of character, I wouldn't expect that we have the same constellation as we did last time. From what we know, we have a relatively conciliatory approach at the council helm. I think what we are also going to have is a bit more of a demanding voice, maybe from the High Representative, with focus also very much on the East, very much on Ukraine and Russia. But overall, I think it will work more smoothly together. Although I think there's a lot more. I know we're going to return to that, but I think there's a lot more which can be done to also structurally make sure that this works better than it has in the past.
Want to come back on that because you two co-authored a paper on this very topic recently, yes. So we will come back on that.
But on the legal woes, of course, there were other candidates on the list. But I think we had the usual game by elimination. You end up with the one name of the right political party family, of course, who nobody objects very strongly to, and that is the name which then goes through.
and they've achieved the geographical balance. We haven't got a gender imbalance, but the other way round for once. So most people happy with that. Just on this point of the machinations and what the Parliament will do, Thomas Limes asks Janis, would Maloney's abstention mean that the ECR group could abstain also during von der Leyen's approval vote? And I know you want to react on how you think this team will work together and what we know about them.
I think that judging on the 28th of June, when all the work still has to be done by Ursula von der Leyen to get support in the European Parliament, it's too early to say how the ECR or how those who are in the right camp, on the radical right camp, will act during that vote. I think that we've seen it also last time around, that there were some votes which came from those radical or extreme radical right parties, also in order to make their case that without our votes, she wouldn't have come to office. Let's not forget, there was a 9 votes majority last time around, so they could make that argument. And so there's a lot that can still happen until the 18th of July. Going back to Costa, I think that one, it had to be a socialist. Second, it is now a tradition, and there are also, I think, good reasons for heads of state and government to seek someone for the office who has been a member of the European Council, who knows how the European Council works. It is also an issue of trust. There is high appreciation among colleagues, among other heads of state, or he's a former head of state, but still among heads of state and government in the European Council for him. He's considered to be a person of reason, a person of compromise. He himself already last night said what he will try to do is that he will help to try to overcome differences between member states. And we also know that he has a good relationship with Ursula von der Leyen. So I think all these arguments made him to be the candidate. And let's not forget, in general, I think there was an appreciation. We want to get a deal. We want to get an agreement. We want to get somewhere now. We do not want to have a postponement, given the volatility, not only within Europe, but also outside Europe. Fabian already mentioned Trump.
Indeed.
And with respect to Kallas, she's very outspoken when it comes to Ukraine, Russia. She's one of the strongest voices when it comes to this issue. She's from Central and Eastern Europe. So I think she ticked a lot of boxes. The question is how she will be able to also bridge the gaps between member states when it comes to strategic questions also related to Ukraine, and potentially if there's a change in the White House, how that might affect the cohesion among the 27 on a question where they are saying that we have shown unity. So it won't be easy for her because she has a strong position when it comes to the issue. But on the other hand, I think these were the reasons why she was put into office.
Thank you very much. There are questions already coming in on the strategic agenda. We will come back to that in a moment. We're going to spend quite some time on that, rest assured, and I'll put your questions to Fabian and Janis then. But I just want to continue in terms of the political landscape, because we've talked already a little bit about the European Parliament and the result of the elections and how it might impact. We talked quite a lot before the elections about the risks of this election and what it might mean in terms of the EU's ability to respond to the challenges that the strategic agenda outlines. What is your sense now, Fabian, of where we are? And as we see the parties jostling for position, some of them are getting bigger, some of them are getting a bit smaller, but we have seen a fundamental change with the ECR becoming the 3rd biggest group. How significant do you think will be, or do you read into this centrist deal on the top jobs a sign that that can hold and that in a sense it will be business as usual, albeit more disrupted?
There's an attempt to signal that it is actually business as usual, that you can still find that centrist compromise, which puts you over the top because it's still big enough to do that. But I think what we are already seeing is that there is a lot of potential for conflict. There's a lot of potential for also disunity to break out on a number of issues, which are going to be very difficult. And just to mention one issue which already has shown its ugly head over the parapet a couple of times, it's budget issues. When it comes to money, what are we going to see? And I think the fundamental question, and that we will come back to also on the strategic agenda, but the fundamental question is not, is this appropriate for the European Union as it was 10 years ago? The fundamental question is, do we have what we need to address the scale and the scope of the challenges which we are facing today? And there I'm rather pessimistic, not least because you also see the very significant domestic upheaval we are having, certainly in France, but not only in France.
Mm. Can I just, on that point, Janis, how you read the potential impact of what looks like being a political earthquake in France with the elections coming up at the beginning of next month? I mean, you mentioned the budget, Fabian mentioned the budget there. We've already heard Bardella talking about French budget rebates and going into battle on that front. I mean, just how much of an earthquake could this be for the European Union as a whole, do you think?
First of all, we don't know exactly what the outcome of the French elections will look like, but it's definitely not making the situation easier because whatever the outcome, it will be an outcome where Macron is weakened. The left and the right are likely to do very well. Let's see how at the end, how well the right will do, how well Le Pen and Rassemblement National will do. However, in any case, it makes France more of an incalculable actor. It weakens Macron, and that obviously is bad news on the European level. Now everyone's not only having their eyes on what happens on the 30th and the 7th of July, but also what the repercussions are for 2027, and what that might mean then for the elections on the presidential elections in France. But I don't think that it is by no means a positive sign. And we had said, and we had discussed also before the EP elections, that probably one of the most worrisome potential outcome of the EP, the European elections, are the national consequences of these elections on the political scene and what that then has as repercussion at the European level. And obviously, Fabian is right. If your level of ambition now needs to be bigger, given the challenges which we're facing, that is extremely worrisome compared with the fact that you have also a coalition government in Germany, which is rather weak and has elections next fall. So in a moment in which potentially there could be even a perfect storm, we at the European level are facing leadership issues at the national level when it comes to European policy making.
And we're also facing, Fabian, leadership issues when it comes to the European level, because we have the imminent prospect of Hungary taking over the presidency of the EU with its very Trump-like slogan, "Make Europe Great Again." You get varying reports, varying assessments of the likely impact. Some Hungarian diplomats trying to reassure people they want to be businesslike, they're going to run the presidency in a businesslike fashion. How disruptive could it be, do you think?
I think the starting point has to be, of course, we always knew that this would be an occasion which Orban in particular will use to grandstand and make Europe great again. Clearly was chosen precisely for that reason. It is a way also of signaling at home that we are showing the Europeans who's boss. We're showing that we can continue to annoy them. Maybe it's also a little signal across the Atlantic. Clearly, there has been also an attempt of Orban to be very close to Trump with a view to the future. When it comes to the more practical side, so far the indications are that things are not fraught, or that the work is going on. But for me, that hides a more structural issue. But that's not just a structural issue which has to do with the presidency. And that structural issue is the question of, are we able to also tackle the difficult issues? Are we able to tackle the things where there is real conflict between the member states? And that, I think, becomes far less likely when you have this constellation where one of the big distractors is in the room, is influencing the agenda, is influencing the tone of the debate. So what I would expect is that this is a further reason why we continue not to tackle the difficult issues, not to have the discussions which we should be having at this beginning of the new political cycle, where we have to be much more honest about the trade-offs we are facing, where we have to be more honest about the deep structural challenges which we have in front of us, which will require also political leadership, which is missing completely at the moment.
Mm. Janis, your thoughts on that, and also linking this, we've talked about the Trump-like slogan. We talked about the prospect of another Trump presidency. A lot of alarm in many capitals and across parts of the US after last night's presidential debate. A sense that things went very wrong for Joe Biden, having increased enormously the chances of Trump winning. We won't get into an analysis of US election politics, but nevertheless, that concern is growing by the day. Would you think the Hungarian presidency make a big difference there in the immediate aftermath of the American elections?
Well, what is clear is that what Orban has in mind is that if Trump wins in the US, and if you see the weariness or the panic even among Democrats after last night, given the performance of Joe Biden and what that potentially might mean in terms of the elections in November, there is a chance that Trump too might really become a reality. It's now bigger than it was before last night. I'm not saying it will happen. I'm just saying that there is a risk. The risk is bigger. That's something which Orban definitely has in mind, as Fabian was already indicating. He also hopes that the result in France will be along the lines of what he hopes. He also hopes that the AfD will do well in September in the regional elections in Germany, and that will give them another boost. So his calculation is that you will have an increasing amount of forces which might not agree on many things. We see now that, that there's a discussion in ECR with respect to whether PiS might look for an alternative constellation in the European Parliament, which is more regional, including parts from Central and Eastern Europe. So there's no unity on the other side, on the right, the radical right side. However, there is the calculation of that view of how Europe should develop in future might become stronger. That's the calculation they have. Giving the presidency, let's be frank, it is the second half of the year. It's still about putting together the new institutions. The European Parliament needs to get its act together before it could start actually working. So we're preoccupied a lot with that. And it's no coincidence that the Hungarian presidency is taking place in the second half of this year. And the role of the rotating presidency is also limited in the Lisbon context, but it still has a role to play. So Fabian is right in terms of the bigger picture of things, and the calculation of Orban might in many ways now work out more or become more likely than it had been before last night.
Okay, so the other thing EU leaders were doing, which one of our questioners argues is far more important than who is in the top team, the question of the direction of the EU over the next 5 years and the EU's strategic agenda. First of all, Janis, let me ask you to do your usual brilliant job of just summing up fundamentally, what does the document say? What do the conclusions in the end say? And then we'll get into whether they deliver. What do they say? And what was the row about? There was a row at the summit. You mentioned last minute proposals for changes from the French and Germans. Why those last minute changes and how serious was that argument? So give us the headlines, if you would.
Well, first of all, the document was prepared over a long period of time. Much longer than it took to be prepared the last time around, in 2019, or the first time when it was prepared in 2014. And it was a discourse, I think, which led to a document which now includes everything under the sky. It is the Christmas the tree list or wish list, whatever you want to call it, which we had already seen forthcoming. It includes everything. Every member state is in one way or the other reflected. It says we will do this, we will do that. By the way, it very much reads often like European Council conclusions. So it's not specific. It doesn't define what the main priorities shall be. It's not ambitious in terms of what we need to concentrate on. It is a long list of different elements, and everyone's somewhat reflected in the document. Now, what happened yesterday was that the French and German together were asking for some last-minute changes to the document that created a lot of annoyance among other member states because again, this was a long process which led to the document becoming the document it now is. But I think it was interesting to see which the areas were they were asking for changes, last-minute changes. So not the concrete changes, but which areas they were looking at. And it was defense, it was competition policy, it was climate policy, and it was enlargement. And I think that's somewhat of an indication of them trying to signal these are the things which for us are most important. So it's not only about the exact changes to the document, which by the way, at the end of the day, were not substantial, but it was the signal they wanted to give beyond the signal of Germany and France is
So
also
they were trying
united.
to put that priority into it that is, as you say, doesn't appear. But Fabian, interesting. So Janis saying there, very much a Christmas tree, something for everybody, a bauble for everyone. But for our audience, a question really about one thing that wasn't mentioned as much as they would have expected. So Peter Boschek says, less important for a change of direction than the top team could be this strategic agenda. No mention of the 24. Target setting, climate neutrality features only once. No mention of the Green Deal. Could it be, asks Peter, that the Green Deal is definitely dead? Morgan Villet also asking, what's the consequences for the Green Deal, and particular for the Circular Economy Action Plan? And then Joe Lynham putting a more political look at it, saying, what concessions will VDL have to make with the S&Ds and Greens to get their vote? So could that play the other way? What is your sense of the degree to which it's clear what the priorities will be for the future, and is the Green Deal dead?
I'll start with just trying my own summary attempt, which is essentially it contains all the things we knew it would contain, and it contains very little about how that is going to be achieved. And I think that was actually the crucial question. How are we going to achieve, especially since there are also trade-offs and contradictions between the different areas. And I think one of the effects we are seeing is that the priority the Green Deal had, the priority climate action, environmental action has distinctively diminished over the period. And it is still mentioned, it is still there, but it clearly doesn't have the prominence which it had before, which means implicitly, not explicitly, but implicitly, there is a prioritization which says this is not going to be the top of the agenda. Now, some people would argue that's because we've done it. It's because the Green Deal has been effectively delivered. So this is now about implementing what has been put into place in the previous commission. But I think it's more than that. I think what we are also seeing is essentially a stepping back from the commitment of prioritizing this over other issues. And what I would expect in terms of policy is not that we will go back and kill the Green Deal, because the legislation is there and nobody's going to go back and take it back. Certainly not von der Leyen, because this is part of her achievement. But what I think we are going to see is a distinctive lack of zealousness in implementation and enforcement.
That's a nice
we
way
are
of
just
putting
not
it.
going to go as fast as we used to go.
And in terms of the text, I'm going to read one line from the text because it sounds rather grand and rather impressive, Janis. It says, we will live up to the call of the Union's founding fathers and ensure that the creativity of our responses matches the size of the challenges ahead of us. And then, as Fabian, you said we had a Christmas tree. Fabian said Christmas tree, but no indication of how you're going to deliver on the baubles on the Christmas tree. Does the content in any way match up to that lofty claim? The creativity of our responses will match the size of the challenge ahead.
No. because again, it is a text which is full of these words, which show we will do what is needed, we will do what must be done, we have understood what needs to be done, but it is a text which is trying to get everyone on board. It is, and by the way, if you talk to those who were working on this text, they will tell you exactly that. What we try to achieve is to find a compromise which reflects all the different interests and the different visions of how things and where things should be moving. So the general approach was, let's try to get everyone under the roof of the strategic agenda, because that's the most important thing. And the logic is we need to have the member states collectively on board if we want to progress in future. And that's why the strategic agenda
It's not
also needs to
strategic
be.
at all.
No, it's not strategic at all, but it is a conscious, what I want to say, it's a conscious choice. It's a conscious choice saying, let's find a way where we have everyone on board. Let's exactly do not what we have been asking for, which is a stronger prioritization. 5 years ago, there was a logical prioritization because the Green Deal was the top priority, and everyone agreed. This time, it's not the case. So we're trying to have everything included in one way or the other. That is a conscious choice. It's not by coincidence. And the question mark is whether this actually leads to what we now need, given the challenges we're facing. And the argument which Fabian and I'm raising is, no, it's not leading us there, because it is trying to, under the ambition of unity, undermine the ambitiousness of what we're trying to do. And in the mid to long term, I think this is the wrong recipe. But again, it is a conscious choice, and we're putting
Can I
aside
play
the
devil's
things that
advocate for a moment?
Yes.
And isn't this what the EU does so magnificently always? It comes up with something which gives you a sense of where you're headed, but keeps the show on the road, keeps the members of the club, everybody on board. Isn't that the very nature of how the EU functions, Fabian?
Ah,
He wants to jump in.
let him jump in.
And I'm sure that I'll say exactly what Janis would say. I mean, of course, we always had this constructive vagueness at the European level. We have to find something which everyone can sign up to. So you always have to sacrifice a certain level of ambition. You have to sacrifice a certain level of concreteness. But it's coming back to the question of what do we need at this moment in time? And at this moment in time, given the challenges which we are facing, given that we have a war, life and death on our doorstep, this is not good enough. It does not address the scale and the scope of what we are facing. So if you had asked us 10 years ago, maybe we could have argued that, yes, of course, and it's more important to keep the show on the road, more important not to have disagreement. But this will not do. This will not address what we have to address right now.
Thank you very much. And Declan Kelleher says he agrees that the strategic agenda reads like long-winded European Council conclusions with large chunks of established canonical language. Getting everyone on board looks like a very long kick to touch, he says. Difficult to see how it will create the conditions to pass the trade-off test at a time of unprecedented challenges. Janis, I let Fabian jump in there. Your reaction to that?
I agree with what Fabian said. I also agree with Declan was saying, because you don't need to go back 10 years. If we would have been now in 2021, I think the logic of let's try to see what we can do, how far we can be, let's be realistic, but at the same time ambitious. Let's try to find a consensus among the member states. And by the way, let's not forget, if we get into a crisis situation, we will get our act together. If things might run potentially out of control, we will do what is necessary. We will find the political will, but we're not in 2021. And if we believe and agree that 2022 and the invasion of Ukraine was the watershed moment, was a European and global incitement. If we agree to that, if that's our reading of things, then I think that's not the right way of trying to progress. Doing it the old way, the way we used to be, to do it. And I wonder what else needs to happen in order for us to realize that we need to be more ambitious than that, even if that means that it will be difficult, cumbersome, that it will reveal some of the difference between member states, that we have to have the difficult discussions about trade-off and not shy away from having these discussions. And we're shying away from having these discussions. And I think in the middle to long term, that is leading exactly to what we're now seeing as the negative effects at the European, but also at the national level. Because if we believe that only collectively we can move forward, and then we're not able to collectively, ambitiously move forward, then yes, we will be, and the mainstream will be, criticized for the fact that we're not doing enough. And that
One
is playing
area,
exactly
yeah.
into the hands of those who want to turn the EU into a different creature. So I understand where politically one comes from in trying to be cautious, following the old traditional method, but I think it is short term and it's leading not to the result we want, but exactly to the opposite.
And one area, Janis, just to follow up on that, that you have repeatedly on Update been critical of the EU for not doing enough is on defence. And Jano Hartikainen asks, how would you summarise the message the leaders sent out regarding the ambition on European defence? Janis.
Not only in the strategic agenda, there's also a text in the European Council conclusions on defense and security. And it's, using the right words. We need to cooperate more with each other. We asking the Commission, the Council to come forward with the concrete ideas and proposals. But then again, when it comes to actually how you will implement it, and that has a lot also to do with money, there are more questions than there are answers. And when there are, whether they are on the table already concretely or whether they're indirectly on the table, ideas of potentially using the example of Next Generation EU in order to very specifically now ask oneself as to whether it would make sense at the European level to have some form of common borrowing in order to implement what one is trying to achieve in Sunday documents, then you see that there is strong opposition. And the German chancellor yesterday was clear because he is facing a lot of pressure within his own government, especially from the FDP, that one is by no means going to go in the direction of common borrowing. So he's fighting back. So there is, again, the discrepancy between the nice ambitions and words and the actual readiness to do what is needed in order to move in that direction.
Fabian?
I think what Janis said is exactly right. I think, yes, we can all repeat the right words, but we're even failing on the basics. We're failing on the simpler things. We all know this is complex. We all know that defense and security is something which also takes a long time. I often have the impression that our leaders seem to think we have years and years in which to make decisions, whereas the opposite is true. Even if we make decisions now, it will take years before we can translate them into practice.
Especially in the area
So
of
we're
defense.
losing time. Every time we have this discussion without concrete steps forward, we're losing time. And we have seen, at least on some levels, we've seen that you can actually move much quicker. And if we had gone 2 years ago to our defense industry, and we had said to our defense industry 2 years ago, we are going to buy your ammunition, and then figured out a way of doing it, and yes, it would have been complicated. Yes, it would have cost money. But if we had done that, we wouldn't be in a situation where Ukraine doesn't have enough shells and bullets.
We do need to move on because I want to come back to the discussion paper that you co-authored and that was published this week. But before we do, one other issue on the agenda, and it links to this, the difficult issues that need to be discussed, the roadmap for internal EU reform. There is some language on that roadmap in the Council conclusions. There was a Belgian presidency progress report. Janis, what do the conclusions say, and what did we learn from the presidency progress report?
As you say, there is a reference to what needs to be done when it comes to internal reform, and there's a reference that takes note of the presidency progress report on the future of Europe, where the Belgian presidency was trying to move the discussion forward in terms to what actually the next steps might look like. The level of ambition had been very high before the Belgian presidency. Let's not forget the last Belgian presidency was extremely important with respect to reforming the EU at the time. So there was a high level of aspiration here. But if you look into the presidency progress report, you will see that it is trying to describe the compromise where there is consensus among the EU 27, it is very careful when it looks into the 4 areas which they have identified: EU values, EU policies, EU budget, and EU governance. It is very careful in identifying what could be done, should be done. It makes sure that the member states are the masters of the ceremony. They consider themselves not being only the masters of the strategic direction of the EU according to the treaties, but also the masters of the treaties. So they make sure that it is them who have the upper hand. The Council has the upper hand. The European Council has the upper hand. But it is extremely cautious. And if I would summarize it, it is the approach of saying it's Lisbon plus. On the basis of Lisbon, with some changes here and there, and even there, we need to be careful when it comes to majority voting because a good number of member states are not in favor of having more majority voting. It is trying to operate on the basis of the current EU treaties by doing a bit more in order to both deal with the challenges we're facing, which we have been discussing, but also dealing with the issue of EU enlargement. So there's a description of what the next step should be, but they're extremely cautious. And one important thing and step will be, and it's also mentioned in the report, is what the Commission will come forward in 2025 when it comes to reviewing policies in view of enlargement. That is highlighted.
A very quick one to you, and then on enlargement, and then a very quick one to Fabian on competitiveness, and then I want to come to your discussion paper. To you, Janis, and a really quick one, if you would, from Frauke Siebas, saying, what message does the strategic agenda send to the enlargement candidates? Given both, you mentioned this was an area where France and Germany wanted changes, and the pre-meetings with the candidate countries. In essence, in a sentence or two, what do you think the message from this summit was?
If I would be from the candidate countries and I would be among those who want to join the European Union and are sincere about wanting to join the European Union, I would not be convinced of what has come out of the summit and what is included in the strategic agenda or in the roadmap. I would not be convinced that actually the member states are ready to do what is their side of the homework that needs to be done in order to enlarge the European Union. I would not be convinced. I would be
Thank you. And Andres Petersons asks, Fabian, what is now planned with the Draghi presentation on competitiveness, and what impact is this likely to have on the future European Commission?
I'm sure that the Commission will say all the right things, but I'm rather very skeptical about whether we're going to see any real action, because any real action will have political costs attached to them. You have to talk about what are the instruments which are available to address competitiveness. And that also means you have to discuss the distortions which are there in the single market, not just always talking about the single market as the jewel in the crown, but actually saying, where does it not work? And that leads you very quickly to issues around common financing, taxation, around state aids, around how we deal with the rest of the world, the lack of unity, the lack of technology investment, all of the things which have been on the agenda for a long time. Is the Draghi report going to make a great difference? I would hope so, because I'm sure it's going to contain many good things, but realistically, I rather doubt it.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me ask you, so I mentioned earlier your discussion paper published this week entitled 8 Structural Innovations for the EU's Next Politico-Institutional Cycle. And in that paper, you argue, for all the reasons we've talked about over the last 45 minutes or so, that the next EU leadership is going to struggle to respond to these challenges, and deliver the sorts of responses that are needed at this time of Zeitenwende. You come up, Fabian, with 8 proposed structural innovations, which you say could ensure that the EU can respond effectively. Can you, again in headline terms, due to lack of time, give me a headline sense of what those structural innovations are and why they're needed?
So we certainly don't have the time to go through them in detail, and I would very much invite people to not just read the paper, but to also debate it, because we're not saying that we have all the answers. What we're saying is that there are things which could be done now, not at some point in future with treaty change, not in a long winded process, but we are saying there are some things which are in the gift of member states and the institutions at this moment in time, which would improve the functioning of the European Union because they would take into account the realities of the situation which we are facing. So they are dealing with the world as it is rather than the world as we want it to be. And that means also recognizing that we need a commission which has to act much more as an executive. It's not only about legislative processes, it's about acting more like a government in some areas. That also means having the means, having the mechanisms to do that. It is about finding new ways of moving forward in a time where there is more fragmentation, polarization, so what we've called adaptive and variable pragmatism. But it's also about finding a common vision. Many of the things we have talked about today come because we have this disconnect between the different strategic agendas, and we're still not having the debate about what are our common strategic priorities and how are we going to deliver them. It's about bringing in citizens more. It is also about looking at the commission structure, looking at how the commission works with the member states, and looking also at how the presidents work together. And then we also stipulate some transversal principles because one of the persistent problems we have in European policy making is the silo mentality, where we're trying to continue to address issues one by one when in reality they're very much interconnected.
Thank you. And Janis, one that intrigues me there, this expression, this phrase you've come up with, adaptive and variable pragmatism. Can you explain in a little more detail what that means? And of those 8 innovative structural changes that you're calling for, what would you highlight as most important from your point of view?
I cannot highlight which I think is the most important. And I can tell you that the result, i.e. the 8 structural innovation, was a process between Fabian and myself, and this is what we agreed and came up for to put down on paper. And as he said, we do not pretend that we have a silver bullet. When it comes to variable pragmatism, I think one element we are seeing in front of us is that we have a situation in which a number of member states, sometimes a very small number, sometimes only one, is not ready to support action at the European level. And the EU treaties, the way the operating system of the EU does not allow the rest to progress, or we've seen that enhanced cooperation doesn't work. So we say that there are ways where potentially that we might have to have an intergovernmental cooperation outside the EU treaties, but following certain principles. And we define what we think are the principles that we need to follow. We also look into things that have happened in the past where we have successfully been able to do and use these lessons from the past in order to progress with what we call an intergovernmental avant-garde. Another example is the establishment of strategic task forces, where we say take lessons from the Barnier method to, on certain issues, put together, especially those which are at the border of community action and intergovernmental action, to progress on in certain fields which we consider to be significant. And we mentioned what we believe could be these areas, but again, it's a discussion paper. We want to have a discussion as to which these areas are where we need these kind of strategic task forces. Or we call for an executive bureau in the European Commission, because we appreciate that we'll probably have now more commissioners in the next commission, which will be coming from countries, and they have been proposed by governments which have a different view about the EU. So we need to find a working method inside the Commission which allows the Commission to be more executive while taking into account that it won't be easier. So we call for this executive bureau. These are just some of the examples. There are much more in the paper, and again, they're being thought as hoping to provoke the debate on the basis of an approach which is doable within the EU as it stands on the basis of the current treaties, while we're not excluding that at some point we might also have to change the EU treaties, but we try to present some ideas in order to enhance the EU's implementation capacity at a difficult moment, because at the end of the day, it's about not surrendering to the fact that we're having all the problems, but rather finding ways, innovative ways, of reforming the EU and pushing the agendas forward.
One final question to both of you, and this time I will start with you, Janis. The paper says, and I'm quoting, the fundamental challenges that we are confronted with should function as a rallying call, not as an excuse for despair, introspection, inertia, and inaction. How can EU leaders be persuaded to heed this call, to respond in the way that you believe they need to? And what will be the consequences if they don't? Now, I want to finish on an upbeat note. So I won't ask what will be the consequences if they don't. I will finish with, what would you say to persuade them that this must be a rallying call, that this is the moment to act and address all the issues that you have at this and other updates? I felt your frustration seeping through. Janis.
You know what? I think that a good number of heads of state and government, many of them, are aware of the difficult situation we are in. But they're also aware that it is extremely difficult to implement what needs to be done. So I don't think that we need to persuade them. I think we need, in terms of what actually needs to be done, we need to persuade them to follow a different path than what we have been trying to do up till now. And that means that we openly discuss also the differences among us. We openly also say that there are trade-offs, that there are difficult decisions that have to be taken, that this will not lead to a situation in which everyone will profit. There will also be losers and winners, and we openly need to discuss that and then find a way to progress on the basis of what we have while having a higher level of ambition. And I think that behind closed doors, there's appreciation for the fact that more needs to be done. The question is how we do it. And I think the way we've tried to do it thus far is not enough, because we are actually muddling through instead of changing gear and moving in a totally different way, which
indeed, and you're indicating there
what needs to be done.
When you say behind closed doors, that this conversation has to come out into the public arena and have a full and frank debate about the future. Fabian, for you, what is the key to persuading EU leaders to respond?
I'm not sure it sounds that positive, but I think, yes, what Janis was saying to start with is brutal truth. We have to be talking about the world we live in and not the world we want to live in. Secondly, we have to start having these debates around what are our common strategic objectives. Rather than trying to muddle through from one crisis to the next, is where do we have to get to and what price do we have to pay for that? I would also say that, and that is also what we do say to leaders, is you have a historical responsibility. This is not about our generation. This is about the next generations of Europeans who will live in a world where they can no longer defend their values, defend their interests, unless we take action now. And that is something we have to also be honest about. And my final point to political leaders would be, is what you're doing now working? Because from my perspective, it cannot get much worse than what we're having at the moment. So at least have the power of your conviction, even if that might mean that you lose your job, because if you're not doing what needs to be done, then you don't need to be in that room.
You wanted to end on a positive note? You wanted to end on a positive note?
I was going to say on that bleak note.
In the roadmap, there are 4 steps that I've mentioned. The first step is what Fabian just described. We need to agree on what are our strategic objectives. But there are other steps that need to be taken. And if you look into the document, those are not ambitious enough. But at least we're starting to move in the right direction. I tried to be a bit positive now.
Thank you very much indeed, Janis. And thank you to all of you for joining us this afternoon. Do take a look at that discussion paper. It's on the EPC website. There's also a policy brief linked to what we're talking about today, entitled The EU's Future After the 2024 Election, Making the Strategic Agenda More Strategic, and a couple of events relating to what we're talking about. Next Tuesday, breakfast policy briefing with the Hungarian permanent representative on his country's priorities for the presidency. And next Thursday, an EPC Talks Geopolitics with James Apathurai, Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO. And we will be back with another update before the summer break on July the 19th. The day after, we are expecting, but it could change, but we are expecting the European Parliament to vote on Ursula von der Leyen's bid for a second term as Commission President on the 18th. So we have scheduled our final update where we will reflect on that and many other things as we head towards the summer break. So do join us for that if you can and you're not already sunning yourself on a beach somewhere. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you for joining us and goodbye.